Part of the challenge becomes a need to redesign the tools, try and make them a bit more fit for purpose. What do we need to take into account? I'll give you a few thoughts here. Firstly, a healthy skepticism for the evidence base. I've mentioned it before, but I'm not dismissing the evidence base, but being cautious in how we use it. Being aware that the evidence base is about large populations, characteristics or factors from large populations, whereas we will be dealing with individual people and their own circumstances. So the tools need to recognize both, but I would say focus more on the latter. We need to engage our clients, our service users, and the whole conversation about risk and the tools. We need to provide the prompts to remind us to do that. And also to capture their language, their terminology, their experience. And this I'll explore a bit more in detail in Module 3. We need to combine what I'll call a strengths approach, which will be the focus entirely of Module 4. Combine a strengths approach and risk in order to provide this more balanced viewpoint. And we need to develop good risk decision making through a structured approach to positive risk taking. So again, when we're redesigning the tools, thinking about the purposes, that is one of the main purposes clearly of the whole of this course, this program, this whole set of resources. Well, we need the tools that will support us to do that. And again, there'll be an emphasis specifically on that in Module 5. My consistent argument will be that we will need different tools for different purposes, and we should constantly be focusing on the narrative detail. Ultimately, if we're going to get out of some of the negativity that I've emphasized through earlier parts of these presentations, then this picture represents it. We need to take a look from a different angle. Taking the risk means looking at information, the situation, the circumstances, even our decision making from a different angle to that which more often than not is driven by bureaucratic approaches to form filling. And in designing such a response, then I'm going to suggest working with risk, a phrase that I use all the time, the name of tools that I developed over many years. But first of all, I do need to emphasize that in elaborating and providing sight of these tools, I'm not expecting anyone to have to adopt these unless you want to, and you can do something within the context of your work. The purpose of me using these here is to illustrate the elements and the components of good design that I want you to understand. Perhaps even the way you should look at the tools you're required to use, but see them in a different light. Use them in a different or a more constructive way. Working with risk needs to be a flexible system, responding to what we're doing in practice. That phrase captures what we do day in, day out. We work with risk. A design response needs to provide a wider range of prompts to support people, guide people to good practice. It needs to focus in on context, the individual situation, but also be aware of chronology, looking at the historical precedents for different risks taking place, historical details of when, but most importantly, related to the context of each time when those risks took place. A designed response needs to guide and support you in the task of good risk decision making in a proactive way, and as already mentioned, the tool to implement this will form the core feature of Module 5. In attempting to capture key information, it needs to also engage the views of service users, the clients, the patients, the people that you work with. It needs to capture strengths-based information, the protective factors alongside the relevant risk factors, and acknowledging the place for positive risk taking. The full picture should be able to balance the negativity of a risk assessment with the positivity of a strengths assessment, seeing this information as the resources on which we can then base our action, build our risk management plan. The final point on this slide is meant to remind us that in a design response, we should offer protection to decision makers, at least by prompting them to reference the source material that was available to them at the time of completing the assessment, on which they may then be basing a decision. And by example, that's all this is, my own working with risk tools. This is what the response broadly looks like. I'm emphasizing this as an example, but I would still ask you to evaluate what's available to you alongside the messages that I put across with this working with risk type of package. These are tools that I developed back in 2007 and revised and updated in 2013. What you get is a current situation, which is very much a risk screen. This could be completed in minutes, updated as and when needed very quickly, responding to the need to provide a brief narrative through the information captured, but also able to respond to circumstances and rapid change. This is, after all, part of a dynamic experience of risk. But then there's the important question, how can risk assessment be dynamic? Well, again, we have to emphasize capturing information quickly and then also updating it quickly. In a service review of the use of these tools many years ago, even I was astonished to hear an example that had been updated in a ward environment many times in the space of a week or so, without staff members complaining of excessive paperwork. On my review, each of those updates had captured the volatile changes in a person's presentation, and the date and timing of each update enabled a quite interesting picture of chaos to be documented as these behaviours were constantly changing. Alongside that one, there's a separate tool to prompt a detailed review, which is the fuller assessment of risk. This is incorporated into the longer timescale, again based on providing prompts to accumulate specific types of information, much more in a narrative format. Chronology is a particularly important section of this format, but it also enables us to capture some of the deeper thoughts about crisis and contingency planning embedded within current risk management plans. Each of these documents are located in the resources section of this module as PDFs, but they also include written guidelines for the flexible ways of using the tools in practice. It's not a rigid bureaucratic mandate. There are specific guidelines for positive risk taking, a tool that is designed for structured decision making, and as I've previously stated, this will be provided in Module 5 of this course. And then there is a focus on risk categories, risk factors. But more importantly, you'll see here, it's an aid memoir. It's not a tick box exercise. And that's a very big distinction. It's about supporting people, guiding people, rather than demanding people spend so much time going through laboriously ticking boxes. The PDF document has already been referenced in an earlier exercise in this module, but I emphasize it here. One important message that it also offers guidance towards examples of protective factors, not just risk factors. And these may help you understand the counterbalance that I'm frequently talking about, the counterbalance of the negativity of risk, the positivity of strengths information. So this is my example of a designed response. You need to evaluate the tools that are available to you by some of the messages that I'm thinking of here in terms of redesign or design responses. Ultimately, in this picture here, the devil is in the detail, and that's what we're constantly focusing on. There is a need to always be curious, be persistent. I want to remind you again, ultimately, we're in the information business. So we need to be constantly delving into the detail in order to keep adding to, and in order to be developing that information. Something else we're doing as part of risk assessment, which I believe is vitally important, or a vitally important message to keep reminding ourselves, it's there to inform our thinking. Risk assessment is not an end in itself, it's a means towards an end. Having already described and prompted you perhaps to be reading the Working with Risk tools and guidelines documents, I would now like to ask you to reflect and make your own notes on what they are offering in terms of good design and guidance for prompting good practice. How do they meet some of the design challenges that I've set out across Module 2? There are no right or wrong answers here. This is for you to reflect and develop your own good practice. Now take a look at the two documents based on a Sabrina case study. Don't get caught up in trying to solve the Sabrina case. It has long since ceased to be a current case. It's not somebody I've worked with for many, many years. But it is still used for illustrative purposes as to how these tools may be used in prompting, but also looking here at how we capture assessment information and the management plans that emerge. Remember, this is an example only, but one that I think highlights good practice. Finally, think about the messages you take away from reflecting on all four of those documents. How will you put some of those messages into your practice? And also give some thought, what might you need to do in your team or service in order to get many of these messages implemented for you?